This edition of Mac Voices is sponsored by lynda.com, the unparalleled online video training library. For a free 10-day unlimited trial, visit lynda.com/macvoices. And by the MacVoices Dispatch, our weekly newsletter for Mac Voices viewers and listeners. Get the inside scoop on all the Mac Voices news by visiting macvoices.com/newsletter to subscribe. Welcome to Mac Voices. This is the Talk of the Mac community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, over this past weekend, Apple quietly, very quietly, raised the iTunes limit for iTunes Match and Apple Music in the cloud from 25,000 songs, something that we've been very disappointed in for a long time, up to 100,000 songs. That sounds like it should be an easy kind of thing to deal with, but there are a lot of questions that I right away thought about, and so I thought I'd go right to the source and talk to the iTunes guy, Kirk McElhearn, and let you listen in. Kirk, it's great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Chuck, hi. It's good to be back.
It's great to have you. It's great to have you. And I would imagine that you're kind of excited because, number one, you're an iTunes guy. Number two, you have a huge music library. And number three, this is something you've wanted to see changed for a long time.
Yeah, I've been complaining about this since iTunes Match was launched back in 2011. So it's just over 4 years old. It was mid-November 2011. And, I mean, if you look at the bell curve of the size of people's iTunes libraries, I'm going to guess that the majority is between 500 and 2,000 or 3,000 tracks. But there are outliers, and serious music fans have seriously large libraries. I've been whittling down my music library over the years. I've created a sort of a second library for things that aren't in the main library. And my main library has about 70,000 tracks. Now, I've probably got about 3,000 CDs, all of which are ripped, or almost all of which are ripped, plus downloads and things that I've bought. And I review a lot of CDs for a classical website in the UK. So I'm always getting music. And for me to try and whittle my library down to 25,000 tracks is impossible. I mean, I've got about, if I just look at my collection of live Grateful Dead concerts, I've probably got about 10,000 tracks there. If I add my Bach collection, there's another 6,000 or 8,000. My Schubert Lieder is German art songs. That's about 6,000 or 8,000. I mean, right there, I'm up to the 25,000. I am an outlier, but I know a lot of people who have libraries larger than me. And a lot of them are classical music fans. Classical music collectors, in quotes, are the kind of people who get obsessed about music, and they don't just want to have one recording of Bach's Goldberg variations. They want to have 10 or 15 or 20. Because, it's like if you go to the theater, I'm a Shakespeare buff, I think we've talked about this, and if you go to the theater and you see a Shakespeare play, well, this production you see here is going to be different from the one you saw last year and different from the one you see next year, and it's the same with classical music. Glenn Gould playing on piano is very different from Andras Schiff playing on piano, which is very different from Alfred Brendel on piano, which is very different from anyone on the harpsichord. So, it's an obsession, granted, but there are a lot of people who do have a lot of music, and they want to keep it in their iTunes library.
And, I can flip it around. You're talking a lot of classical and a lot of Grateful Dead. I too have a large unauthorized recording library, shall we say. And, I think there is something to be said for that, because if you're really into that particular band, the show they played Friday night is not the same as Saturday night, and it's not the same as the next week. And, depending on how obsessed you are, it's something that you can do. And it doesn't take a lot to get over that $25,000 mark.
25,000 track.
25,000 track.
Although if you consider that a track on the iTunes store costs $1, then $25,000. It's actually cheaper than that. In classical music, you can get big box sets at really reasonable prices. I just ordered a set of 114 CDs by Alfred Brendel, an Austrian pianist, and it's costing me with shipping 124 pounds. So let's say $200-ish for 114 CDs. So it's less than $2 a CD. So on the classical side, you get all these big box sets with 50 or 80 or 100 CDs, that are less than $100. So classical collectors, we have these big piles of box sets, and of course, it takes a long time to rip all these CDs, but that stuff adds up. And that's Apple Music. So let me explain exactly what we're talking about here. iTunes Match was something introduced in 2011. It would scan your iTunes library, and it would either match the tracks you have with tracks in the iTunes store, or if they weren't in the iTunes store, it would upload the tracks in your library. Now, the name iTunes Match is used, but it's not. So if you look in iTunes, once you've turned on iTunes Match, it's not even called that anymore. It's called iCloud Music Library. It works the same way, and it works in conjunction with Apple Music. So this is going to get confusing. iTunes Match, iCloud Music Library, Apple Music. The 25,000 track limit is for music in your library that you didn't purchase from the iTunes store. So if you purchase 20,000 tracks from the iTunes store, you can still put another 25,000, or you could put another 25,000 in the cloud. Now, with Apple Music, this gets really complicated because it's so easy to add things from Apple Music to your library. You see an album, you like it, or you might want to listen to it, you click that little button to add to your library. 10 tracks here, 20 tracks there, another 10, another 20. Pretty soon, you've got a few thousand tracks from Apple Music, and Apple Music tracks count against that track limit. So the only thing it doesn't is purchased iTunes Store tracks. So what Apple's done is they've increased this to 100,000, which is good both for the obsessive music collectors like me and for people who are starting to use Apple Music and adding more and more stuff. Imagine that you go through the For You page on Apple Music and you see playlists you like, and every time you see one, you listen to it and you add it to your library. Well, those playlists are about 10 to 15 songs. They're about an hour each. And add 100 of them, and, that's what? 100 times 10, that's 1,000 tracks right there.
Right there.
Add some albums. There are some big, what they call digital box sets. You can get all of Herbie Hancock's recordings in 2 sets. One's acoustic, one's electric, and I think it's about 1,000 tracks for the 2 sets. And this shows up as 2 albums in Apple Music. So click, and you've added 1,000 tracks to your library. So it adds up very quickly. And increasing the limit to 100,000 means that the outliers who will have more than that are very, very few. And it's hard to feel sorry for someone with more than 100,000 tracks that they can't match.
Yeah, because at some point you start doing the math and you're going to spend the rest of your life listening to your library once.
Well, you can't listen to it all. But so here's the thing. I have 25 recordings of Bach's Goldberg Variations. And if I get a new recording to review, I might want to go back and listen to a couple of the ones I have that I may not have listened to in 5 years or even longer. But there may be a reason, the same way you've got books on your shelves and CDs and DVDs all on your shelves, you want to pull them out every once in a while. With this, it's a little bit easier to have them in the iTunes library instead of searching for the CD and all that. It's not essential. I could nuke half of my music and just keep it on CDs, things that I rarely listen to. But it's the convenience. It's, this is the promise that they've been making about computers for us, that we should be able to do all these things.
And with Apple Music, I think we are approaching it. It's just that we get this very strange, we're in this strange gray zone where you and I and a lot of people have bought CDs for a large part of our lives, and therefore we already own the music. You don't want to buy it again. Some people would say, well, just don't worry about it because it's on Apple Music, and so you don't have to own it. You can just be renting access to it. And that's true to some extent, but I also personally have a lot of, go through and I have a lot of albums that are out of print, and for whatever reason, they're not available. And especially then if we get into our respective unauthorized recording libraries, you have that situation. So
sure. Live recordings and bootlegs, you're not going to, I have tons of Dylan bootlegs, and none of those are going to be available.
Right.
And don't forget that there are artists and labels who don't allow their music to be streamed. If you're a jazz fan, then you know the German record label ECM. Their music is not available to stream, with the exception of 2 or 3 compilation albums on Apple Music, and that may be on Spotify as well. They pulled their stuff from streaming a while back. In classical music, the British label Hyperion, which has a wonderful collection of, I don't know, they've got about 4,000 CDs that they've released over the years. It's a medium-sized label. They don't do streaming at all. So you are going to find gaps in the collection. And as you say, things that are out of print, there is... Apple claims, I think, that there are 30 million tracks on Apple Music, but there's an awful lot of stuff that's not up there.
Yeah, and depending on how eclectic your tastes are, too. If you're very much an AM, FM, radio, mainstream kind of person, the odds are that that's going to be a service that is perfect for you, and you're never going to have to worry about it. But that's not everybody.
Right. So the opportunity to match or upload the tracks that aren't in Apple Music means that the promise that Apple made was that you could combine the library of the music you own with the music you rent. Unfortunately, this is fraught with errors. The metadata gets changed. The album artwork gets changed. I mean, I was looking at my library today. Out of the albums that I uploaded, I'd say 50% aren't even displaying artwork anymore. And believe me, I religiously apply album artwork to everything I rip. I make sure my tags are perfect. So it's not an ideal situation. On the other hand, you can start now for $10 a month and creating yourself a very large music library, selecting stuff you like from Apple Music, adding it to your library. You listen to it. If you don't like it, you get rid of it, and you can keep adding more, and you can do the whole thing. Again, this is for obsessives. Let's say you're into jazz and you discover, Miles Davis Kind of Blue, and you find out that people like Bill Evans played on it. So you discover Bill Evans, and then you find who played bass with him in the albums they were on, and the albums that got influenced, and then the other keyboardists that played with Miles Davis, people like Chick Corea, and you look at his music, and so you can go off in this rabbit hole with Apple Music, and you can very quickly add an awful lot of music to your library. And you may not want to listen to it the way I generally listen to music albums as albums. You may just want to put stuff on at random. You may just want to make some smart playlists. You may just want to see what comes up and say, "Oh, hey, I like that. I'm going to click the little heart button so I can remember it." Having all this music doesn't mean you're listening to it all. It means that you've got this sort of wellspring of music you can choose from at any time.
Today's Mac Voices is sponsored by lynda.com, the unparalleled online video training library. Get a free full 10-day trial at lynda.com/macvoices. If you're interested in learning or in acquiring new skills or advancing the skills you already have, there's a lot to like about lynda.com. Lots of little things, but this time, let's focus on some of my favorite big things. First, the breadth of training available. 4,100 plus courses in audio and music, 3D and animation, education, design, business, and a whole lot more. Second, the depth of training. It's rare that you'll only find 1 or 2 courses on any given subject. Sure, if the subject or program is new, but for topics like design or video, there are over 500 courses to choose from. So you aren't going to just scratch the surface, you're going to take a deep dive into whatever you need or want to know about. Third, the instructors. These aren't just talking heads or narrators, but are actual experts in their fields, people who live and breathe their areas of expertise. That makes a big difference since they know what to teach and how best to present it. No one reads from the manual. They take you through the steps on the path to understanding. Fourth, the constant updates and additions to the lynda.com library. Lynda.com is constantly adding new courses in current and new topics. Every month, sometimes every week, a few more get added to the collection, so that everything I said about their library is not only true today, but it will be true tomorrow, next week, and next year. Fifth, the convenience. With the lynda.com iOS apps, I can take lynda.com anywhere, anytime, online or offline, learning where and when it suits me on my schedule, not someone else's. And if you have an annual premium membership, you can even download and view lynda.com courses offline on your desktop or laptop. Sixth, the price. For a single, affordable fee, I have access to everything lynda.com has to offer. No tiers, no special levels, everything. Legacy content, new content, videos, instruction pieces, the iOS apps, monthly magazine type shows, and much, much more. Seventh is the fact that you can try it all out for yourself right now by visiting lynda.com/MacVoices. When you do, you get a free, full 10 days of access to the entire lynda.com collection. If you can stay awake that long, that's 240 hours of training just waiting for you to try. Your biggest problem during those 10 days is going to be trying to decide what to watch first. Once you subscribe full time, well, you're probably still going to have that same problem, since there's so much great information on lynda.com. That's lynda.com/MacVoices for a free, full 10-day trial. Do it now and learn something new and useful today. Thanks to lynda.com for their ongoing support of MacVoices. Okay, so a couple scenarios here. Let's start with, because I guess one of the reasons I want to especially get you on is a lot of us are going to be tempted. I resisted the temptation to go into my preferences and say, okay, now I've got more than 25,000, click, and potentially have problems with my library. So, Kirk, what's the best way to do this? Is it to do just that? I mean, obviously, I will take this out of your mouth and say, before you do anything, have a backup of your library right away.
You want to back up. There are a couple things you want to back up. In your user folder, that's the one with the little house icon on it, go to the music folder and then go to the iTunes folder. You want to back up that iTunes folder because that contains a library file which has got all of your playlists and everything. You want to back up your iTunes media folder. That has all your music in it. And you want to put that in a safe place because if Apple ends up, what was the word I used? Munging. When they munged my library, when they introduced iCloud Music Library, you want to be able to revert to a backup. So that's the first step.
Okay.
The next thing is you want to decide. So you have two options here. You have iCloud Music Library and you have iTunes Match. iTunes Match costs $25 a year. You can use it without Apple Music, but you need to turn on iCloud Music Library. Think of iCloud Music Library as the umbrella. And then underneath, you have a couple of scenarios. So if you pay the $25 a year for iTunes Match, you get one thing, and I'll get into that in a second. If not, you pay the $10 a month for Apple Music. Now, what I would recommend is that you do both, and here's why. If you've only got Apple Music and you turn on iCloud Music Library, iTunes is going to match for upload some of the tracks you have. But what's going to happen is if you re-download them to another device, they're going to have DRM on them. So they're going to be encrypted with your iTunes account. The files, you won't be able to play those files if you ever cancel your Apple Music subscription. Now, if you never delete the original files in your iTunes library, it's fine. If you never re-download them on another computer, it's fine. Because, see, here's one of the good things about the cloud. I'm talking to you on my MacBook, but I can have the same music available here that's on my iMac because the iTunes library goes to the same place. It just pulls down the tracks from the cloud.
Stop there for just a second, okay, because I want to make sure we're real clear on this. If I've got a completely blank iTunes library and I rip an album and I then load it into the library and have this turned on, what happens to those tracks? Do they go up, or does just the metadata, the information go up and say, oh, okay, now he has access to all the tracks on Led Zeppelin 1?
Right, it depends. So iTunes will attempt to match your tracks, and they use something that's called acoustic fingerprinting. If you're using, this gets complicated. If you're only using Apple Music, it doesn't use acoustic fingerprinting. It only uses metadata. So presumably, if you've named it Led Zeppelin 1 and the song names are correct, it'll get matched correctly. If not, the tracks get uploaded. Now, if you're using iTunes Match, which is another $25 a year, then they use acoustic fingerprinting. So even if your metadata says, The Little Drummer Boy by Alvin and the Chipmunks, it's going to match Whole Lotta Love by Led Zeppelin because, the way Shazam works, it listens to a few seconds and it can identify the track. Well, it's a similar thing to that. So anything that you put in your library will either get matched, which means it doesn't need to be uploaded. You're not using data. Or if iTunes can't match it, then it gets uploaded. Now, iTunes is going to match an awful lot of stuff. It'll match anything that's in the iTunes store, and I've seen it match things that are not available in certain countries because they are available in other countries. So it's as if iTunes has this massive library in the cloud, and there are little flags saying which countries they can be sold in, but they can still be matched. There are a few exceptions. Your tracks have to be 96 kilobytes per second or more. So if they're really low quality, they won't match. They have to be less than 200 megabytes. So if a track is a full album long, it might be too big depending on the bit rate. And I think they have to be less than an hour. So there are 99% of your songs are going to work with iTunes Match and either be matched or uploaded. Sorry. So what you said was interesting. You talked about an empty library. So imagine you've got your iTunes library on your iMac, and you get everything to match and upload, and it's in the cloud, and you open up your MacBook Pro, and your iTunes library there's empty because you never copied anything over from your other iTunes library. All you do is you click that little preference in iTunes General Preferences, use iCloud Music Library, and you wait a couple of minutes, and all of a sudden, all your music is there. Now, it's not physically there, but pointers are there, like aliases. So if you double-click a song to play it, it'll start downloading, and you'll start playing it immediately.
Okay, and I think that's a key point, that you have access to all your music, but this is a little bit of a tangent, but just since we went there, let's go there. I open up my MacBook, which has no music. I click that little button. All of a sudden, all my music shows. When I decide to pick Led Zeppelin 1, what happens? Am I streaming that music to my computer, or am I downloading that track to my computer?
Technically, you're downloading the track. It gets stored in a cache folder. If you then click the little button to say that you want to download it, iTunes will copy it from the cache folder to your iTunes media folder. It won't request it a second time. As long as it's still in the cache folder, you see a little cloud icon next to the tracks when they're not in your iTunes library. And you've already listened to something, just click that cloud icon, and it immediately shows up without the cloud icon. So iTunes transfers it from the cache folder to your library. So the first time you listen to something, it will download completely. It's not an actual stream like, say, Spotify, where you listen to the music and then it's gone. If you listen to the same album 5 times, you're only downloading it once, and then iTunes is playing it from the cache. Just to give a concrete example of how iTunes Match iCloud Music Library can be useful. My son is a big fan of what's called EDM, electronic dance music. And he's got a very large library of music on his MacBook Air at home. Yet at work, he uses a Mac. So what does he do? He loads up his iTunes Match library at home, and he goes to work, and all the music he wants is there. He doesn't have to carry a hard disk to copy music or anything. Let's say he gets a new album one day. The next day, he can listen to it at work without having to worry about it. So it's not only a good situation for, you're at home, you got 2 computers, or you want your iTunes library, you want to listen on your Apple TV, but also remember your iOS devices can access this library. So if you're out with your iPhone and your headphones, assuming you've got the bandwidth, because, this does use bandwidth, you can stream your music, and it's the same kind of thing. It downloads once, and the next time you listen to a song, it doesn't need to download again.
How large is that cache? Do we have control over that? So, because that I can see that starting to chew up the space on my MacBook Air very quickly.
Yeah. So there's no setting in iTunes to limit the size of the cache. I'm just looking in my iTunes folder to see how big mine is. It's not here. Sorry. It's in a library, caches. Mine was a few gigabytes last time I looked. There's no setting to control it. No, it's not in there. Where is it? I don't remember where it is. So there's no setting to control it. You can delete it manually. And of course, if I could tell you where it was, I would tell you how to do that. But I don't remember where it is. Oh, right. It's in the iTunes media folder. Apple Music, and so mine is currently 3.27 gigabytes. It could potentially use up all the space on your hard drive. I haven't tested it, and I don't know anyone who has, but I would assume that iTunes is smart enough to start deleting files when you get to that point. So you can delete this folder, and it'll delete all the cache. You can delete it manually, but there is no setting in iTunes to click and delete cache or anything like that.
Okay. And to be clear, you say it's in the iTunes Media folder, so that's in your user folder?
So that's your user folder, Music, iTunes. And then within that, you have iTunes Media, and you've got folders like music, movies, TV shows, podcasts, etc. And one of the folders is called Apple Music, and it contains a series of artist folders for music that you've downloaded and streamed.
Got it. Okay.
It's a little bit confusing. I think iTunes should have something in its preferences for you to choose, A, to delete it when you're running out of space, and B, to choose a limit as to how much space can be taken up. The Spotify app does that, I think. You can choose, how many gigabytes will be used by the cache.
Right. So I feel like there's so many places I want to go and questions I want to ask, and I don't want to miss them. So
it's complicated, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not as simple as just turning on some. For most people, you just turn it on and you forget about it. But when you start looking at the sort of flow chart of, do I want to do this? Do I want to do that? What happens if I do this and that? Then it does get a little bit complex.
So I'm trying to make it easy for us. Okay. So if I have a 10 album collection, all right, and that's my entire iTunes library. All right.
Yep.
And I go to Apple Music and I say, oh, this 11th album looks interesting. And so I hit play. You're telling me it downloads to my iTunes library on my Mac, and it's taking up space on my hard drive.
Okay, if you hit play, it doesn't technically download to your iTunes library. You won't see it in your library.
But it'll go to the cache, won't it?
It will when you play it.
Okay.
If you click the little plus button, you'll see it in your library, but it'll only go into the cache folder when you play it. So in my iTunes library, I'm on my MacBook now, and this is the one with where I use Apple Music, and obviously it doesn't have a lot of space. I've probably got a few hundred albums that I've never listened to or played. I've just gone through and added them to the library. So when you do that, it adds a little to the library file. There's the album art and there's the metadata, and it's pretty much, 200 or 300K for an album. It's when you play it or download it, choose to download it to the iTunes library, that it's going to start taking up space. So my iTunes library on this Mac here has 10, 15,000 tracks, but it's only using about 28 gigabytes, whereas that many tracks would be 100, 150, 200 gigabytes if everything was downloaded.
Got it. All right. So again, let's just try to finish some of this off. So can I do any damage to the iTunes structure if I go into the Finder manually and delete those cached files?
No, you can't. And again, you probably don't need to worry about it unless you're really running out of space. Now, of course, if you have a laptop and you don't have a lot of space, and you've got some movies and, maybe you edit video and stuff, then you might not have a lot of space. So it's best to go through the easiest thing would be to go through the iTunes library and remove anything that's been downloaded or played that you don't like, that you're not listening to. It's too easy to add all this stuff to your library, and it's a lot harder to clean it out when you realize you don't like it.
Right.
And that's another one of the things with something like Apple Music or Spotify or any of these, where you can add music and playlists to the library. It's real easy. It's a click for an album, a click for a playlist. It's a lot more work afterwards to clean it out when you've got too much stuff. So it's worth thinking carefully before you add something. What I do is I add a lot of albums, and I listen to some of them, and then I display them in date order to see, what's the most recent. And I'll look back and I'll think, okay, I added all these albums of Indian music, and I kind of like Indian music, but it kind of all sounds the same to me. So I'll delete half of them and come back to them later. It's easy to be a pack rat with something like Apple Music, so it's good to avoid temptation. Me talking about pack rat with music, right?
Yeah, I'm thinking the same thing, both of us, yeah. Yeah, I think let's look up pack rat in the dictionary, or both our pictures are there when it comes to music.
Yes.
So, okay. So, all right, I'm going to go. I have one other question, but I'm going to save it because it may be more relevant to the next part. So we've talked now about some of this, but let's talk about the matching and the downloading. That if I have something that doesn't have an adequate bit rate, iTunes will give me an updated version of that.
That's correct. So if it's 96K or higher, let's say you've got some 128K MP3s you bought from eMusic way back when. If you match them and you're using iTunes Match, not just Apple Music, they match. You can delete your originals, then download the matched files, and they'll be better quality. They'll be 256K AAC files from the iTunes Store. So you can sort of upgrade your music. And that was one of the selling points of iTunes Match early on, actually, saying, you can upgrade your music if you have old files, as long as they're not below 96K, not too bad.
Okay. So here's
and this upgrade thing might be the reason it took so long for Apple to increase from 25,000 to 100,000, because record labels get a small, but they get a payment every time a track is matched. It's a very small payment, much less than a stream, but they do get a payment. So Apple is saying now, well, we're going to be paying more to record labels because you're matching more tracks.
Got it. Did not know that. That's good.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is where my concern came in, because as we were talking pre-show, I have substantially more than 25,000 tracks in my library. But if I click that, and again, I'll keep the numbers easy. Let's just say that I have 20,000 tracks that are 128 KB. They are eligible to be matched and downloaded with the higher quality. Does it look at my library and say, 20,000 tracks, go? Or do I have to play them, or exactly how does that part work?
No, it's pretty much immediate. So when you let's talk about iTunes Match, because remember, that's the one that does this without the DRM. And so if you want to re-download the files, you'll be able to play them. It just scans your library and it starts matching and it starts uploading. Now, with 25,000 tracks, when iTunes Match was first launched, I think it took my son about 10 days and he had about 20,000 tracks. So it's not a fast process the first time around. You're going to wait. You're going to be, depending on how many tracks match and how many need to be uploaded, you are going to be uploading a fair amount of data. After that, of course, subsequent updates are much quicker. It's like when you do a backup, the first time everything's backed up and the next time it's only what's new. And that'll happen automatically. But the first time it can take days.
Okay, but maybe I didn't ask it, or maybe you answered it and I just missed it. But I'm talking about those 20,000 tracks in my library that are 128K. All right? Yeah. You're telling me that iTunes Match automatically says, okay, those 20,000 tracks, we have tracks at 320K. And so we're going
256
or 256, yeah. So we're going to replace all of those on his machine.
No, nothing gets replaced.
Nothing gets replaced.
What happens is if you match them, and if you find that they're matched and you know your tracks are low quality, you can delete your local copies. So what you do is you delete in your library, but you don't delete them from the cloud, and then you can re-download them from the cloud, and then that's when you get the better quality. It doesn't push anything to you.
Ah, got it. Okay. So it is a kind of a manual process.
It can be a time-consuming process if you want to upgrade a lot of low-quality tracks, yes. But of course, you can just make a smart playlist where, bit rate is less than 256K, and everything will show up there. So you look in the smart playlist, you can add another condition, iCloud status is matched, and that way it'll eliminate anything that was uploaded that wasn't matched, and you'll see everything quickly that's eligible for an upgrade. You can delete them all. No, if you delete them from the playlist, they get deleted from the library. So you need to, let's see, you make a smart playlist, two conditions. Bitrate is less than 256K, iCloud status is matched. You take the contents of that smart playlist and you put it into a new regular playlist, not a smart one. At that point, you can delete all those tracks, but keep them in the cloud. So they'll show up in that playlist with the little cloud icon. Okay? And then you'll want to select a bunch and choose download. You don't want to do them all at once, because if there are thousands of them, it'll just clog your network for a while.
Okay.
So it is a manual process. It can take a lot of time. When I've done that, I mentioned eMusic because I was an eMusic member for ages. And if you remember, for a while they had an all-you-could-eat thing for $10 a month. So you would download anything you wanted, but the quality was just 128K. After that, they moved to something where, I don't know, you got a certain number of albums per month for your thing, maybe 5 albums a month or whatever. And so when iTunes Match first came out, I upgraded an awful lot, thousands of tracks that I had from eMusic. And they didn't all match, but I matched an awful lot of them. And so I did that. And I would download them an album at a time or an artist at a time.
Okay, that's a really good strategy right there, is to try to do it hopefully by artist, but if you have a huge collection of a particular artist, maybe by album.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yep.
Okay. Something that you mentioned much earlier, and I want to come back and integrate it into this discussion, is cover art, album art.
Album art.
You said you lost a lot of album art, and I'm curious. At one point, I think that iTunes assigned, or I believe it was associated directly with the track. Then it was being stored somewhere else and being matched up. What's the current state of album art, and how does it relate to all this?
Okay, so album artwork is part of what's called metadata. Metadata is the data that describes a file. So in the case of a music file, it's the album name, the artist name, the song name. It's also things like a rating and a last played date, but album artwork as well. So if you rip a CD with iTunes, if you tell it to, I think it's in the general preferences, it can automatically download album artwork from the iTunes store if it recognizes that album and if that album is on the iTunes store. If not, I search on Google, and sometimes I even scan CD inserts when it's not available. When you get the album art from the iTunes store, it's not embedded into the files. It's stored in a different folder, kind of like a cache folder. But iTunes knows where it is, so it displays it whenever you select a track or an album that has that artwork. The reason it's not embedded is it saves space. If the artwork is, say, 200K and you've got 10 tracks, that's 2 megabytes. And while that doesn't sound like a lot on a computer, when you've got a 16 gigabyte iPhone, that 2 megabytes for every album is going to add up. So if you add it manually to a CD you've ripped, or even tracks you purchased from the iTunes store, then it gets embedded in the files. And so one of the problems is that when you upload, when you match and upload tracks to iTunes Match, if you delete them from your library, sometimes iTunes loses track of that album artwork. Sometimes it also puts the wrong album artwork. And in fact, early on with iCloud Music Library this year, the library on my iPhone was just a shambles, the artwork for different albums and artists, or sometimes the same album 20 times. For like half of my Dylan albums had the same cover. So the artwork doesn't get matched, but once the track is matched, it gets pulled down with the metadata.
Okay.
iTunes is complicated. It really is. You know, for a lot of people, you search for, Taylor Swift or whatever, and you play it, and that's fine. But once you get into the finer questions of maintaining a library, there are a lot of things to think about.
Well, and folks, I will repeat what Kirk said earlier. This is for obsessives like us who, we care that the cover art on the album is the correct cover art, and we care that the tracks are in the right place with the right albums. So
in the right order, with the correct titles, without typos in them, without with the right capital letters, and well, here's an example. So if you play music on your Apple TV from your iTunes library or from your iCloud Music Library, and there's no album artwork, you get this big gray thing on the TV screen with the musical notes in it, and that doesn't tell you anything.
Yeah.
When I look at a playlist of music, there is as much a visual reminder from the artwork as there is from the titles of songs. When I'm scanning through albums in my library, I don't need to read the titles because I'm familiar with what the covers look like.
Yeah. Okay. Good point. Good point. Yeah.
I mean, you can think of an album more quickly when you see its artwork than when you read a title. That artwork, unless it's something you've only heard once, that artwork for you represents the album. It's a kind of a gestalt of the album itself. Come on, we grew up with LPs. We'd sit there and look at these big album covers and all that, But it's a visual reminder, and that's why album artwork is so important.
Yeah.
I mean, how would you browse the iTunes store if there was no album artwork? Imagine.
Oh yeah, I mean, it would be impossible.
Yep.
You would have no, like you say, you'd have no frame of reference. You'd have the artist, but unless you are a real fan and you've learned which tracks go to which albums, yeah, it would be crazy. So at this point, I don't know. I want to say, give us some tips on how to make this transition, because it's a positive transition, but it also, as you can tell from the discussion, folks, it's fraught with a few pitfalls. If you're serious about your music, if you really don't care, then don't worry about it. But assuming that you do, Kirk, any tips or guidelines or things that you did as you started to implement the new 100,000 song limit?
I haven't done that yet.
Okay.
I've since iCloud Music Library wreaked havoc on my library when it was first launched, I will not put my main library in the cloud. So if you are obsessive about your music, you might not want to do this. You might want to, if you've got two Macs as I do, so again, I'm talking to you on my MacBook, and this is my test Mac, and anything I put here I'm not too worried about. And so I've been slowly building up the library on this Mac. Ideally, I'm just pulling stuff down from Apple Music because it's quicker, but there's an awful lot of stuff I have that's not available there. And I'll add some stuff, I'll let it match or upload, and then I might delete it locally because, I've got a 256 megabyte SSD in this Mac, and there's a limit as to how much it'll hold. Make that backup, decide whether you want to go into it 100%, or if you do have two Macs, use the second Mac to set things up. And do it slowly. You could even set up a second user account on your Mac, so you don't have to risk your carefully curated library. Do it gradually. It's safer. Wait and see if you have any problems, if metadata is wrong, if album artwork gets changed, and then add more and more. And you'll quickly see what can go wrong and what'll work.
I don't like the way you said that. You quickly will see what can go wrong.
Well, you will. I mean, Jim Dalrymple famously turned on iTunes iCloud Music Library for his library. Everything got messed up. And Jim called me one day. He was almost in tears because, he's a music guy. He plays and everything. And he was like, "What did I do wrong?" I said, "Jim, you didn't do anything wrong. It just doesn't work 100%. We've been using Macs for so long. We remember when things were simpler, right? And a lot of people lament these days about all that goes wrong. I've got a problem with this MacBook. Battery life is terrible, and it's Time Machine that's using all the battery, and I've been talking to Apple Care for a week, and they can't figure it out yet. So there are all sorts of things that can go wrong.
Yeah, there are, and as you can tell, with the obsessives, just like here, there are a lot of things to think about, and if you really care about it, then it's not an easy thing. I often try to explain to people why sync is not an easy thing. You think it's simple. Yep. It's just, okay, I want everything everywhere. Yep. Yeah, that's fine. But, what happens when something changes, and what happens when one device goes offline and a file gets updated? It's not an easy thing. And this is not necessarily easy either. And that's one of the reasons I want to make sure we got you on and at least have people kind of aware that you just don't want to click that button without thinking, and definitely not without having a backup.
Yeah, you got to have a backup. As you say, sync is not easy. It seems like it should be. Recently, I keep getting old Safari bookmarks showing up in Safari. I don't know where they're from. They're like from 3 years ago, things I deleted ages ago, and they keep showing up in Safari. iCloud has never been reliable. And the whole music library, it's a different sort of thing, but it's still cloud, it's still sync. And it's funny, someone reminded me today, and you'll appreciate this, and I was talking about my problems with the MacBook and the battery, and saying, well, at least you don't have to use Conflict Catcher.
Oh, boy.
So for those who are too young to remember that, there was a time when there were these things called extensions in Mac OS, and this goes back before Mac OS 10, so this is prior to 2001. And if they loaded in the wrong order, they could cause conflict. So there was this wonderful app called Conflict Catcher. Was it Cassidy and Green that made it?
Cassidy and Green,
They,
yes,
they
sir.
were the ones that made the flying toaster screensaver, weren't they?
Don't know about that.
Yeah. And so it was a utility that could do two things. It could let you change the order at which extensions would load, and it could also indicate certain extensions that could conflict with each other. So it was both a post hoc troubleshooting tool and something to help you prevent trouble. And we all relied on that. It was like that you'd have all these problems. You'd start up your Mac and you'd get the sad face. They don't do the sad face anymore, do they? I wish they did. And so you'd press whatever key it was to get just conflict catcher to boot up it, to launch it boot, and then you'd reorder things and uncheck it. Oh man!
Yeah, but hey, it worked, and
once you sorted it out, it worked. Yeah, once you figured it out, and because they actually had a very large database of what worked with what and which had to be loaded before what. I mean, when you think about it, it's ridiculous now, but yeah, this was how it is. So.
So at this point, Kirk, do you think it's safe? I realize I may be asking the question just a little differently. Do you think it's safe, assuming a backup, for people to turn this on and try it and play with it? Or do you think we should wait just a little while to make sure that the bugs
if you've got a backup, I would say try it, but make sure you've got that backup. Make sure you're prepared that something could go wrong. But if you're in the demographic for whom this can be useful, you've got two computers, one at home, one at work, you want to listen to stuff on your iPhone that's in your library. I've got a 128 gig iPhone. I've got about 6,000 tracks on it, and I've got some space. I could hold maybe 8,000. But imagine you've got a library of 50,000 tracks, and you want to be able to access anything because you're out driving, and you just have to hear Born to Be Wild, right? And it's not on the phone, but it's in your library. That's what it's for. It's for those occasional times. Of course, if you have Apple Music, you can get the track from Apple Music. But one of the advantages of iCloud is you can download things when you want them, and when you're out of range, when you're out of cell coverage, you can still listen to them if you've downloaded them in advance. I mean, if we were in a perfect world where you've always got cell coverage, then you really wouldn't have to worry so much about that sort of thing. But we're not. Heck, I walk out my front door, I have no cell coverage. So,
yeah, yeah. Or you'd go deep well, you don't even have to go deep into certain buildings. You just step in the door, and your cell coverage goes away.
Well, so you can see these stone walls here. They're about 2 feet thick. Since there's already no cell coverage where I am, I have what's called a femto cell. It's a little tiny cell. You plug it into the internet, and it acts like a 3G cell. So I have cell coverage inside the house. But once I go out the door, I'm in a rural area, and there's no coverage.
Right.
So, if I go out walking, I go out to take a walk just for exercise. I go through the village, and there's a couple of areas where I get coverage. But there wouldn't be enough for me to stream music all the way. So I need to make sure that I've got music on my iPhone if I want to listen to music. And I like listening to music when I walk. So
I have an idea that we're going to see a number of articles, or at least a few articles out of this whole process on Kirkville, your website, which is HTTP, the usual stuff, McElhearn.com.
That's right, McElhearn.com.
And folks, even if you're not interested in Match and Cloud and all, definitely visit Kirk's blog because he's got a lot of great stuff there that is iTunes and not always necessarily iTunes.
Oh, a lot more than iTunes.
Yeah.
And I get ribbed that I write a lot about Bob Dylan and the Grateful Dead and Shakespeare and all that.
Hey, that's okay.
But yeah, it's the things I like. I write about what I like. So I write book reviews and CD reviews sometimes, and I write about the Shakespeare productions I see here locally because, for those who don't know, I live a few miles from Stratford-upon-Avon, which is where the dude was born, and they've got theaters. So yeah, I write about Macs, I write about iTunes, but I'm a pretty curious guy.
And of course, I want to make sure we also mentioned the Take Control book.
Yeah, Take Control of iTunes 12, the FAQ, which was just updated a couple of weeks ago to take into account some recent changes to iTunes. And you can get that from takecontrolbooks.com.
Great. Kirk, thanks so much for spending some time with us, and I hope we've educated folks a little bit, give them some things to think about as they make this hopefully positive transition.
Thanks for having me once again, Chuck.
We'll do it again.
Okay. Good night.
Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is Mac Voices. I'm going to go take some of Kurt's advice and play with my iTunes library and see what happens. I hope you'll do the same, and let us know. I'm on Twitter. Kirk can be found at Kirkville. Let us know how it goes. Until the next time, thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for links, show notes, to subscribe, to connect with Chuck on Twitter, Google+, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and the MacVoices blog. Subscribe to our weekly newsletter, the MacVoices Dispatch, to stay up to date on all the latest MacVoices news from our front page or at macvoices.com/newsletter. Do more with your Apple tech by subscribing to the free MacVoices magazine on Flipboard by visiting macvoices.com/magazine. Advertising and sponsorships handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CashFly at cashfly.com.